Introduction to Information Retrieval. He has over 20 years of research spanning algorithms, web search, and databases. He has published over 100 papers and holds 20 issued patents, including several on link analysis for web search. Prior to joining Google in 2012, he founded and led Yahoo Labs, served as CTO at Verity, and held various leadership positions at IBM Research. Dr. Prabhakar holds a PhD from UC Berkeley in computer science and a Bachelor of Technology in Electrical Engineering from IIT Madras. He is a member of the National Academy of Engineering, a fellow of the ACM and IEEE, a former editor-in-chief for the Journal of the ACM, and was a consulting professor of computer science at Stanford University. In 2009, he was awarded a laurea honoris causa from the University of Bologna. Dr. Prabhakar Raghavan, it's an absolute honor for us to welcome you to the session. Over to you, and look forward to listening to you now.
Thank you so much for that extremely kind and generous introduction. Hello, everyone, and happy Holi, I guess, is the season. Thanks again for that warm welcome. And thank you all for the invitation to speak here today. There's a lot going on in the world right now, and my heart was with everyone affected by the war in Ukraine. So I appreciate you're all making the time to join me for what I hope is an interesting conversation on the evolution of computer science. I've been watching a few of these alumni talks on YouTube, of course, and they're typically either about the person's professional journey or about interesting technology trends. I thought today we'd try and cover a bit of both. First, a bit about my own path since IIT, beyond the official bio. So I went to IIT Madras back when there were just 10 hostels. I lived in Godavari. I know that many of you are just returning to campus, and I'm glad that conditions have improved. We have a chance to experience the beauty of the IIT Madras surroundings, including random monkey and deer sightings, and the thrills of heading outside the gates to Waldy's or catching up with friends at Quark. What sets up IIT apart from any place I've been before or have been since is how smart and often ingenious my classmates and peers were. This may seem obvious to you now, but you'll realize the extent this is true many years and institutions ahead in your careers. I also made many lifelong friendships at IIT and have the WhatsApp groups to prove it. Many of my classmates have gone on to be really successful in life, and it's great to see them giving back to their alma mater in so many different ways. After my undergraduate, I moved to the States to get my PhD at Berkeley. Back in those days, you chose to get your PhD or go into industry. Academia and industry were parallel paths, but they rarely converged. And yet, right before graduation, I sort of made a left turn and went to work for IBM, so industry. But I was at IBM Research, and for about a decade, I focused on the theory of algorithms, a field that gave me a discipline and power of abstraction, I would say, that helps me to this day as I juggle complex issues in computing and society, something we'll talk about in a moment. It's an interplay that is constant, growing, and that'll almost be the centerpiece of my talk today. It was several years before I decided to work on web search. Some days I point to a speech I heard driving home one night by the developer of Mosaic, the first browser, Mark Andreessen. Most of you haven't seen Mosaic, and that's totally understandable. It was created circa 1992. Other days, I'm not sure what sparked that fire in me, but regardless, I woke up one morning, got to work, went to the team I was leading at IBM, and I said, let's work on web search. Back then, it's hard for you to imagine, but web search was horribly broken. You'd be lucky to get what you were looking for after a dozen query attempts. And still, I thought it was amazing that people had access to so much information about virtually anything, and that the fact information is so empowering caught my attention, and it's amazing. Even at that early stage, the web ran the gamut from truth and authoritative information all the way to untruths and misinformation. Back then, most of this misinformation was commercial in motivation. And so while computer science at that time was interested in web servers and caching and routing, the web collectively was already an engine for societal and economic information needs. Around this time, my path crossed with the soon-to-be founders of Google, Larry Page and Sergey Brin. I was moonlighting on the side as an adjunct professor at Stanford, and Larry and Sergey were students, thinking about the power of links on the web and how they conferred signals of authority on web pages. Larry and Sergey and my team would meet occasionally to exchange ideas in the best academic tradition. During one of these meetups, they told me they had decided to start a company, which would eventually become Google. They suggested that I join them. I demurred. I said, "No, you're not going to succeed." So the moral of the story is, if you need advice on joining a startup, come and ask me, and then do the exact opposite of what I say. My team and I continued our research, studying, as did Larry and Sergey, the use of linear algebra in search ranking. We also elicited the community structure of the web by studying the web graph. And I won't get into a lot of detail on this. I'll touch on this briefly in a little while. From there, I went to work in enterprise search and then led Yahoo's research division. And over this time, I expanded my scope as a manager, became more and more interested in the business and the personnel side of things, taking on larger and larger teams. The question on all of your minds is probably why. And I've had this exact question from many well-meaning mentors who said, you were a good research scientist. Why would you try to become a manager? Stick to what you know. But I'd argue that scientists and leaders have a common skill, and that's the skill of asking the right questions. As both a scientist and a team leader, you don't need to have all the answers, but you do have to ask the right questions. I started to see management and leadership as a craft, or as the Merriam-Webster dictionary puts it, an art. And so I continued down the path of management, and years later joined Google, first in research, then to work on products and probably use in your education, like Gmail, Google Drive, and Google Docs. Now, that role was full of interesting technical challenges, like working on machine learned grammar correction that's now pervasive across these products, or building smart reply, which suggests replies when you have a Gmail coming into your inbox. So you can automatically pick one of those suggested replies. Today, I'm responsible for many of Google's core information products, like Google Search, Google Maps, Google's advertising products, and a variety of other products whose logos you can see on the slide. I won't go through them all. And it's been a return to roots, if you will. I'm constantly humbled by the opportunity to work along truly brilliant people on a problem space that's constantly evolving. Now, back in the early days of search, I was drawn to it because it was a cognitive need that isn't subject to computational limits. So what do I mean by that? What I mean is you could have all of the computers in the world, the most powerful computers, and still you might not be able to build a better search engine. You see, so it's not bound computationally. Now, this blew my mind then, and to this day, my team and I always say, search will never be a solved problem. But there's more to it than only computational limits, which is the domain of my early research. You see, the early view of the web was a marvel of computer science, but that gave way to the web as the greatest socioeconomic artifact since the printing press. Yes, there are servers and routers and operating systems powering it all, but the real object of interest is how users, most of whom care as little about the underlying computer science as they care about the origin of electricity in their homes. I mean, you don't worry about where the electricity comes from. How these users interact with this web, this socioeconomic artifact, right? So the point is users don't care what's lying underneath. And that's where the most interesting insights are. And so we need to obsess less about computer science on its own and instead look at the computational view of social behavior. So today, I'd like to pose perhaps a provocative question. Is computer science a social science? And if not yet, should it be? And I think you can guess my take on this. Right, let's look back on the history of computing. Let's back up and see. This is heavily oversimplified, but it's a history based on who at every point was determining what problems computers should solve. If you went back all the way to the Second World War, almost over 75 years ago, early computing was about power for nation states. It was about moving forward geopolitical agendas, the Enigma machine, the Colossus, who can crack the enemy code. At that time, computer science wasn't quite a discipline yet. Alan Turing was hard at work in England, sure. And the first academic American computer science department wasn't even founded until Purdue University in 1962. So at that time, compute cycles were in the hands of around 100 people, and they were mainly physicists and military generals. By the time you get to the 1970s and 1980s, this changed. An emerging class of corporate chief information officers stepped in, and they had fascinating problems to solve using computer science, like payroll, printing paychecks, digital bulletin boards. With that, computer science became more enterprise focused. So you got email, relational databases, distributed computing, networking, and so on. And computing became more and more corporate driven. This went on until roughly the mid-90s and the advent of the web, which began to democratize access to information. And with that, consumer preferences set the tone. You see, over the last 25 years or so, we've seen how consumer needs and behavior have driven the computer science agenda. You have graphical user interfaces, you have cloud computing, machine learning. These are all direct products of what billions of users want, not tens of thousands of corporate people or hundreds of generals. All right, so let's look ahead next. I believe the next era of computer science lies at its nexus with the social sciences. Broadly speaking, the social sciences are a range of academic disciplines that study humans in the context of society. When you initially think of social sciences, fields like psychology, anthropology, and sociology probably come to your mind. Most of us probably didn't pore over social studies much beyond early schooling. Since we were young, our spare moments were devoted to computer science, math, physics, algorithms, working to get into IIT. But I'll assert that the future of computer science needs to move on out of this purely technical and logical realm and into the socio-technical. And today, I'd like to share a series of vignettes and stories to illustrate this idea. All right, let's go to my first story. It's about Gen Z. At Google, we always say, start with the user and all else will follow. If you do start with the user, you'll see that preferences are rapidly evolving, driven by younger generations. Many of you are part of Gen Z, which is the first generation to grow up as both digital and social media natives. Your expectations for technology are different from the generations before you because you've grown up with technology. You expect more natural, human, and intuitive computing experiences. For example, you expect digital assistants to understand you without you having to change how you speak to them, right? You expect technology to be immersive in the real world, like how with Google Maps, you can scan your phone around you and get walking directions overlaid on the real world in augmented reality. You expect more visual content, like if you search, how do I fix this? You probably want video instructions along with step-by-step explanations. They say a rising tide lifts all boats. As younger generations' expectations of technology rise, so too do the expectations of older generations. Our user research team puts it like this: where younger generations go, the rest will follow. This isn't new. It turns out up and coming generations have always driven technology forward. Millennials were pioneers of the smartphone revolution. And before that, Gen X was the first generation to popularize video gaming and one of the fastest growing entertainment markets. So while you might be the most influential generation today, 10 years from now, don't look at yourselves. Keep your eyes on the youth of that time, of 10 years from now. All right, my next story is about search quality, but actually it's about, you guessed it, social sciences, namely psychology. It's about something we call the peak and rule, which is a psychological phenomenon, a cognitive bias that impacts how people recall experiences. Our experiences as human beings are very subjective. There are numerous heuristics that color how we evaluate our experiences. And the peak and rule is a 2-for-1 in this sense. You see, here's what we do. Instead of basing an experience on the total or average of all its moments, research from Fredrickson and Kahneman shows that we define an experience according to how we feel at its peak, the most intense point, no matter good or bad, and at its end, the peak and the end. So how does this relate to computing? Well, it means the measure of something like search quality from the user standpoint is not the average or the sum of all of a user's experiences. It's likely their worst and their most recent experiences. So as we design our systems, we need to constantly work to ensure that a user's worst experience isn't a failure, and that we demonstrate we made the best attempt to provide them with helpful information at every point. So while logic might say that, the edge case happens 0.00x% of the time, we cannot ignore these edge cases because user trust suffers on those worst case experiences. So consider this as you go out into the world and begin designing algorithms and other technology. You need to know what impacts trust in order not to break it. All right, let's go to my next story. This has to do with how ads show up on a search results page. You enter a commercial query and you might see ads above the search results related to the query. At Google, the number of these ads can be anywhere from 0 to, in a small minority of cases, as many as 4, depending on how commercial the query is. So if the query is very commercial, it looks like the user wants to buy something, there'll be more ads, otherwise less. In this example, the screenshot, you see 2 ads. Now, the selection and ordering of these ads is done by complex algorithms. I'll give you a little bit of insight on this now. But behind the scenes is some fascinating microeconomics, a branch of economics, and by tradition, one of the social sciences. So I want you to envision millions of potential ads in our database. We need to figure out which ads, if any, to show on a query, and the order in which to show them, number 1, 2, 3, etc. And all of this has to be figured out in roughly 200 milliseconds, just to give you a feel for the constraints our engineers work under. Now, advertisers would like their ads to show higher in the order in order to gain more clicks, because the higher you're on the page, the more clicks you get. Our job as the Google ad engine is to decide which ads are most relevant to the query, to this user, and show them highest to provide the most value to the user, right? Okay, so each advertiser, so here's what's going on behind the scenes. Each advertiser says, hey, here's my advertisement, Google, take it. And they tag that ad with the query or queries for which they want their ad to appear. And along with this, they give a bid, which is the maximum amount they're willing to pay if they get a click on their ad. So they may say, If I get a click on this ad, I'm willing to pay up to $2. Okay. If nobody clicks on that ad, they pay nothing, even if it is shown. Okay. So think of the incentives here, right? The advertiser would like to only pay when they get clicks. They want to get clicks. Google doesn't want to show ads that don't have any clicks, and that would waste the user's attention as well. Okay. So we have two factors. First, how well does the ad match the query at hand? And second, how much did the advertiser bid for that query? So the questions we have to answer are, how do we use these factors to position the ad? And how much should we charge the advertiser if they get a click? Now, your first guess might be, you know what, let's just order all the ads matching the query by the amount they bid. So on the top, we put the advertiser who bid $2, next $1.50, and so on. Okay. And if they get a click, we charge the advertiser the amount they bid. So if the $2 ad gets a click, they pay $2, otherwise $1.50, and so on. Okay. So charge the advertiser the bid for each click they get. In fact, this is what the pioneer in search advertising, a company called Overture, did. And Overture eventually became a part of Yahoo. Well, it turned out this wasn't quite right. It turned out this led to a strange and spiky set of bidding wars between advertisers. You see, and here would be the highest bidding advertiser, and then the next advertiser would slowly bid their way up and get to that higher position. And then the one that is currently in the top would say, well, there's no point in my bidding so much. They would drop immediately. And then this person would say, well, I can drop too. And so they would sort of bounce around in this sort of sawtooth fashion that you see in this plot due to Edelman et al. It's a great write-up by Edelman, Ostrowski, and Schwartz that explains why this weird behavior happens. All right, so Google introduced two changes to rationalize this based on microeconomic theory. First, instead of ordering the ads only by the bid, the ordering used by Google combined the bid with the relevance of each ad to the query so that users weren't bombarded with irrelevant ads that had high bids. And second, and please pay close attention to what I'm about to say. Second, the price paid by each advertiser was not their own bid, but the next lower bid. So in the earlier example, I said one advertiser had $2, the other said $1.50. If the $2 advertiser got a click, they paid $1.50, which is the next lower one. This is what economists call a second price auction. In other words, the highest bidder would pay the second highest bid, therefore less than the maximum they are willing to pay. The second highest would pay the third highest bid, and so on. And thanks to the underlying microeconomic theory, which, by the way, won a Nobel Prize long before Google. So this is classic microeconomics. Thanks to this theory, advertisers lose their incentive to engage in strange and spiky bidding, like you see in the slide, and the system stabilized. These changes were introduced by Google some 20 years ago, but since then a steady stream of advances in microeconomics have continued to improve the state of ad auctions. This is a great example of academic research influencing an important industry, an industry which supports a vibrant ecosystem that includes small businesses and advertisers around the world. One of the things that I always find moving is stories of small, sometimes one-person businesses, whether in India, sub-Saharan Africa, all over the world, that are able to reach their markets thanks to such search advertising. The next vignette I want to share is about an important current topic. It's about misinformation. Now, at first glance, this might seem like a problem that sits squarely on the shoulders of the social sciences. Who's a computer scientist to say what misinformation is? One that we need legal and policy people to tackle, not computer scientists. And part of that is certainly true. But at the same time, fighting misinformation is a dynamic, incredibly technical challenge. And I'll try to give you a flavor for this. Just consider every single day, about 15% of the queries we get on Google search are queries we've never seen before, because information is always changing in the web and out there, and we need to keep up. Some of this is just algorithmic. We combine hundreds of signals to determine which results to show for a given query, from the freshness of the content on a page to the number of other quality pages that link to it. We are constantly working to surface the highest quality content for every query, but there are times when that's not enough. For example, there are times when interest in a topic is traveling faster than the facts, or at least the well-established and written facts, like in the case of medication that's just been announced, or for a supposed UFO sighting. To help with this, we've trained our systems to detect when a topic is rapidly evolving and authoritative sources haven't yet caught up and weighed in. In these cases, we show a notice indicating that we're unsure of our results, asking our users to proceed with caution on the information we surface. In other words, you've come to Google, you say, hey, tell me what's going on. We say, well, here's what we can show you, but for this query, we, Google, actually are not sure we have the right information because we don't have authoritative sources to corroborate what we are surfacing. Now, this represents a definitive shift from the premise where we present our algorithmic results as always dependable to one where users seek and will receive more information on why they see certain results, whether these are governed by authoritative sources, in some cases governmental mandates. So for instance, during the COVID pandemic, a lot of local governments came in with their own mandates. Some want masks, some want social distancing, and so on, right? And so this isn't just a matter of what Wikipedia says, for instance. You have to pay attention to a lot of other factors, and we will be as transparent as we can about that. It's all part of our work to help people better understand when high quality information is available and what differentiates high quality information. My next vignette is about how user interfaces impact decision making. Let's start with a fairly clear-cut example. It's a canonical one that's often cited by behaviorists. A number of studies over the years and decades compare the rates of participation in employer-sponsored retirement and pension plans when enrollment is automatic versus when plans where employees must act voluntarily to become enrolled. The studies find that automatic enrollment dramatically increases participation rates, even though when you automatically enroll, an employee has the opportunity to say, no, I don't want it and drop out, right? So in the one case, you're automatically enrolled, but you can drop out. In the others, you're automatically not enrolled, but you have to opt in, right? So participation rates in pension plans increases with automatic enrollment. Beyond that, it helps educate people about better savings processes. So this is just classical work. Now I'm going to give you a relevant case study from our own work at Google with Google Flights. We launched a feature last year that shows a carbon emissions estimate for almost every flight in our search results, similar to how a food menu might show calorie counts for its food items. Travelers can use environment footprints like these CO2 counts to make educated decisions about flights and filter accordingly. And our testing found that when users saw the CO2 impact of their flight options, they were more likely to avoid flights with higher emissions, right? So the point is just showing the CO2 emission. We weren't telling people to choose this flight or that. Just showing the CO2 emissions conditioned what users ended up choosing. Okay, my next vignette on this continuing theme of the intersection of computer science and social science connects to an article I read over a decade ago in Wired magazine. Chris Anderson wrote this article and then a book on the topic called The Long Tail: Why the Future of Business is Selling Less of More. Okay, you have to parse that carefully. This is generally considered a business book, but it's got very interesting ramifications for computer science as well. It's this idea that many products, each in low demand, can collectively build a better market share than the few bestsellers and blockbusters. In other words, a bigger inventory is a competitive challenge. So for instance, Netflix has a massive inventory as opposed to a movie theater can only show a small number of blockbusters. And so Netflix over time gained share. Now, you see this distribution of a long tail for lots of things pervasively across the planet. People's preferences of movies, for what cities to live in, books, clothing, many products, right? So many products, each purchased very few times, together make up a large fraction of all preferences or accesses. Now, when you look at this long tail, you might think, well, the world must have two kinds of people: the type that make up the head of the distribution, the normal people who do the mainstream things. So listen to pop music, play video games, watch cricket. And then you have the weirdos in the tail who do weirdo things, like all they care about is clown tricks. No offense to clowns. But the reality in a beautiful piece of work by Goel et al., and the et al. Are at this point colleagues at Google, the reality that they show is that actually it's not there are normal people and weird people. It's that we're all a bit weird, right? I know I am. So what that means is, sure, we have common overlaps in the head of the curve, like we all buy toothpaste, but then we each have different eclectic or tail interests. Like I might want to buy a very niche kitchen gadget, and you might want to buy an unusual phone accessory. So in the tail, we all differ, but on the head, we all overlap, right? So that's the picture that Goel and company developed. Now, why this is important here is we as computer scientists have historically thought when we design and analyze algorithms, whether for content recommendation or for customizing a user interface, your traditional view is that everybody gets a little bit of everything, but in fact, it's everybody gets a little bit of the most important things like toothpaste, and then everybody has a different tail interest, right? So this view of everyone is a little weird is something we need to digest both qualitatively and mathematically. And you can actually build mathematical models that feed the analysis of algorithms for this phenomenon. So this nuanced view of a long tail behavior can be incorporated in our analysis of algorithms. All right. My final vignette is on machine learning. And of course, it has to be because I've been with Google for a decade. In fact, tomorrow is my 10-year anniversary at Google. And you know, we love machine learning here. Right? It wasn't that long ago when Google first introduced a machine learning technique called transformers, which became the basis for many other machine learning breakthroughs, like AlphaFold for protein folding, and BERT, which I'll talk about briefly, for language modeling and language understanding. If you aren't familiar with the BERT model, it considers the meaning of a word or a sentence by looking at the context, the words and sentences that come before and after it. The famous linguist John Rupert Firth said, "You shall know a word by the company it keeps," which is a beautiful way to sum up the context-dependent nature of language. BERT revolutionized the ability for computers to understand natural language. In this example, it's able to look at two sentences and determine if the second sentence, the corpus, is connected to the first or just a random sentence. This sort of sense-making led to a huge quality improvement across Google search. We were able to give much better search results. And beyond Google search, because we open source BERT, so anybody can use it, you can use it. Right? In this example, BERT would realize the importance of the phrase "for someone" to the meaning of the query. What the user was trying to say is, can I go to a pharmacy and pick up medication for someone else, which in some places you can, and some places you cannot. It depends on the local laws, right? So that's what they meant by someone. And what understanding the "for someone" is help search return more relevant results for you. Now, despite the incredible power of machine learning models like BERT, it's always a game of cat and mouse with changes in technology and changes in communication. This is because how we communicate as humans is endlessly complex and rich. Just think about how we tell stories and crack jokes, or how language evolves over time. Think a few months ago, nobody was saying Wordle, and yet it's so commonplace now. Right? And this goes back to my earlier comment that 15% of the queries we see each day are brand new, right? Because there are new memes evolving. And of course, if I said a trying night out before a quiz is likely to lead to a cup instead of an S, you should stick to the study plan and thump the quiz. Well, you might know what I mean, but a basic NLU, natural language understanding model, probably wouldn't. Human communication is one of humanity's most brilliant tools, and yet, because of its complexity, it's also one of computer science's biggest challenges. Let's say you have a very nuanced question or need, something that's not quite so easy to put in what I call keywordis that you type into a search bar. Take this question about hiking. I've hiked Mount Adams, which is a tall mountain in Washington state in the US, and I want to hike Mount Fuji in Japan next fall. What should I do differently to prepare? Now, it'd be easy to ask someone in a conversation like an expert, but today, the way you would approach this is, if you don't find an expert, is probably try to simplify and transcribe it into hours, potentially days of interaction with Google and other information sources. Then finally, hopefully, you deduce an answer. And the question is, wouldn't it be a lot better if you could just express yourself the way you want to? We're trying to apply ML to help you do just that. Recently, we announced our latest ML model, which we call the Multitask Unified Model, or MUM for short, which is about 1,000 times more powerful than BERT. This model can simultaneously learn, understand, and make sense of information across multiple languages over a wide range of sources and formats, including picture, speech, video, etc. We're working on implementing MUM in Google Search so that in the future, you can express your question in whatever way is most natural for you, whether that's typing, speaking. In a locale like India, for instance, we get 5 to 10x as many spoken queries as in the rest of the world, right? A photo or a combination. So whatever mode of input works for you, we let you compose your query. Now, for the nearly 800 million people in the world who struggle to read or write, you can imagine how this can be so powerful. They might be able to search by snapping a picture and asking a question at the same time, a spoken question. Just like you might point an object to a friend and ask, how do I fix that? Then they could get an answer back to them in a variety of forms. But this isn't just a marketing pitch. My point is we need to continually study, recognize, and adapt to how human beings communicate in the real world in order to make technology more helpful. I shared several vignettes today, several stories with you, and each of these, next slide, please. We look at how people and how they engage with large-scale computational artifacts. What you see in all of these examples is that human behavior is shaping computer science and vice versa. It's no longer enough to say there are sociologists or behaviorists. They sit in that part of the campus or these places in governments, and even user experience practitioners who maybe sit in design companies. And then there are computer scientists, right? They all have to converge. It's also cyclical. Social changes give rise to new technological changes because society demands more technology, which give rise in turn to new social challenges and changes, and so on and so forth. We often point to innovations and say they were ahead of their time, whether it's Charles Babbage's analytical engine, the forerunner of the modern computer, Da Vinci's helicopter, or even Google Glass. But I'd say that while timing is a part of it, context, societal context, is even more pivotal. And beyond that, how ideas are communicated. Really smart people have ideas that fail. And it's not usually because they have bad ideas from smart people. Sometimes it's because they didn't take into account the societal ramifications, or because these smart ideas are poorly articulated and explained. You might think that some disciplines are irrelevant to yours. I challenge you to be open and hungry to learn about a variety of topics, especially the social sciences and communication. The future of computer science demands that we all be intellectually curious about human behavior, not straightforward mathematics and algorithms alone. And I'm speaking to you as someone who spent the bulk of their life on mathematics and algorithms alone. So you might think that's a tinge of hypocrisy, but I mean it. When we understand and appreciate the interaction of technology with human behavior, we'll be able to open up entire new frontiers for computer science. So that's all from me today. I look forward to taking your questions, whether on my journey since IIT Madras, the confluence of computer and social sciences, or of course on the Google interview process, because I inevitably get asked if it's anything like the movie, The Internship. It really isn't. Thank you, and now over to you.
Yeah, thank you for that, sir.
We can take the slides down.
Yeah, so we have a few questions from the audience, and we've also collected a few questions beforehand as well. So the first question I would like to ask you is like, it's something to do with a little bit of sci-fi, but since we have social science involved in this talk, I think it comes under the purview of this. Considering that there's been a rise in ML, AI, and data science in the recent years, and say targeted ads, etc. How likely is it that, and so there's also been questions going around about the free will of the user reducing because, say, because of the ads that I see on Google or any other website for that matter. How likely is it that the actual choice of a person is compromised?
Yeah, I think this is a great question. So first of all, I want to remind you that advertising per se is not new, right? It's over 100 years old, right? The internet and the web, Google and others, have changed two things. First, as you observed, using better computational techniques to try and put the right ad in front of the right user as opposed to something irrelevant, right? You could argue that that is actually a good thing, right? So that nobody's attention is being wasted, right? You're not going along a street and seeing a billboard that has no relevance to you, right? The second piece that the web and computer science have brought, and then I'll wrap it up with answering your question, is the ability for advertisers to tell if their advertising is actually effective. This is called the measurement science, right? About 100 years ago, a famous marketeer called John Wanamaker had a very classic quote. He said, half your advertising budget is wasted. The problem is you don't know which half, right? So today we have better tools at telling which half or which hopefully 10% is wasted, and then improving your effectiveness by being more accurate. Now, as you said, does that remove free will, right? I think having advertising is actually positive. It supported newspapers and traditional media for years. And in time, it supports, I would say, tens of millions of small voices on the web, people who otherwise would have no subsistence on the web, right? So that's one good thing. The second thing it does is it ensures that small businesses like the kind I mentioned, a one-woman business, a weaving shop in southern India, can access a buyer in Alabama in the US, right? So I think that's very powerful, right? Now, what you're touching on a little bit though is, when do you know it's overdone, right? And excessively intrusive and invasive for the user, right? Now, the way I would answer that is, for a platform like Google or Facebook or whoever else, right? Excessive advertising is not a good thing because it compromises users' trust and interest in that medium, right? Whether it's a search engine or whatever. So certainly at Google, one thing that we factor into the algorithms that show ads is the impact on the user. And we look at the long-term impact of an ad, not just did we show it or did we not, right? And in so doing, right, we try as carefully as we can, as best as we can model, to not overload and overburden the user, right? This is not an exact science, but we're getting better at it over time, excuse me. And I believe that it's in the interest of the platforms also not to overdo it.
Thank you, sir. Next, Professor Ravindran has a question.
Yeah, go ahead, Professor Raghavan.
I think Professor Ravindran is on mute.
Yeah.
Hi. I didn't expect to actually ask the question. I'm actually walking. Uh, so, hi, Prabhakar. Can you hear me?
Hi. Yes, I
Yes.
can.
So, my question was something about, Tim Berners-Lee has been going around trying to get people excited in this whole new area called web science. I don't know if you've come across that yet.
Yes.
So, that has resonance to what you were talking about. Is it correct to say that, or is that a completely different take on the impact of the web on the world?
No, Tim has been espousing this for a while, and it's in some sense, qualitatively, it's the same thing, right? What I was trying to do with my several examples was to give you why this isn't just some abstraction. It is actually something that you and I and all of us can and should be working on. And it's actually pivotal to the future of the web. And that's why Tim goes around giving these talks about why it is so important, that the web is not just about servers and caches. It's really about the humans. And so I absolutely support his going around giving these talks.
Yeah, just to pick, we have one of those web science trust labs in IITM. If anyone is interested in knowing more, come talk to me.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for that, sir. Up next, we have a question from the audience. So this is in relation with your talk where you mentioned the importance of UI, UX, and user experience for a certain technology and how they might be ahead of their time. So does this mean that we should shift our focus on design and UX rather than putting more time onto the actual developing the actual technology in itself? Because if a technology is developed and it's not opted by the public, it is not useful.
Now, that's a great question. It's one that I deal with every day, just in my day job, right? So you called it design and UX, right? There are a couple of different pieces. I'll break it down to. And in almost any project, you will find that the answer is yes, we need more, right? So the first part is what we call UX research. Right? This is the research you have to do before you start to build the product. Okay. So, for example, I made the broad comment that Gen Z shapes technical trends, right? What does that even mean for Gen Z to shape technically? So, our UX researchers went out there. They went to India, to places in Africa, to the Amazon and Indonesia. And one of the things they realized is if you take my Google Maps product, it looks like a map, right? It looks like a map on a phone. But think about it. Many of the people who use it have never seen a paper map. So why should we build a product that looks like a paper map? So the first piece of UX research insight is don't give people who've never seen a paper map stuck on a phone and call it maps, right? You had to find some other way, which is why we started thinking about, the design phase said, well, we should do augmented reality. You should hold up your phone and, be able to use that to guide your walking, right? That was the design piece. And that requires some magical underlying computer science and technology. What's the first insight that came up when we launched that feature? I think we launched it in London. People are holding it up and walking, and they kept running into lampposts and each other, right? So that piece of UX research in turn led to a design change, which was, if you're going to do this, we're not going to let you do it for very long. We will force you to sort of look up every now and then by putting the phone down, right? Otherwise, you're going to bump into something or somebody or hurt yourself in a traffic accident, right? So always try and anticipate through user research the needs the user will have, and then follow that up with the design, however demanding it is on the underlying computer infrastructure, right? So that's sort of the trifecta.
Thank you for that, sir. So the next question I would like to ask is a little bit more personal. So we've been getting a lot of questions about your life at Google, or like suggestions or advices that you might have to give to us young undergraduates or people pursuing MTech in IIT Madras. So what are a few key learnings that you have from your life that you can tell to young people?
Wow, that's a big question. Let me reel off a couple of things. The first and most important is I've personally been very fortunate through my life, and I think many of you are as well, to be surrounded by really smart people. Okay. And what that means is you have to open your mind to learning from all of them, because everybody around you, no matter how silly they seem to be, actually has something to teach you. So open your eyes and ears carefully, speak less and listen more, right? And you will learn something for sure, right? That's one important thing, right? The second thing goes back to something I mentioned briefly in my talk, right? As you learn and listen, you'll start to synthesize your own ideas. And any idea, when you first think of it, is incredibly complicated. I remember this at various points in my career, in my life. Even when I was doing my PhD thesis, the idea that crystallized after 7 or 8 revisions was very clean and simple. But the first version was incredibly complicated and was, I don't know, 5 pages of mathematics. At the end, I could distill it down to like 2 lines, right? So refine, take your early ideas, refine, simplify, simplify, simplify in a way that you can explain it to anybody. And this comes to the communication point that I made earlier, right? I often have colleagues who will come and say, I've prepared an hour of presentation to show to you, or to show, my boss Sundar Pichai, the CEO of Google, right? And what often happens is the meeting starts 10 minutes late, so 20 minutes late, because Sundar is a busy person, right? And the person is still giving their 1 hour talk. No, your 1 hour just became 40 minutes. It may become 30 minutes, right? It may be that the meeting is interrupted for some important reason and is over in 5 minutes. You should be able to adapt in real time and communicate crisply and clearly, and be prepared to give the 1 hour version of your idea, the 30-minute version, 10-minute or 2-minute, all on the fly. Okay? And one of the things I unfortunately really don't like about this format of the video conferences, when I normally speak, I like to see the audience in front of me and read whether they're following what I'm saying. And if not, I will tailor what I'm delivering. Okay. This format, I cannot see, unfortunately, all of you. So I don't really have a good sense of, does it make sense to people? Because in some sense, it doesn't matter what you're saying. What matters is whether the audience is understanding, right? And that's critical, because if you haven't gotten the audience to understand your point, whether over an hour or 5 minutes or 2 minutes, right? The so-called elevator pitch, where you're in the elevator with the most important person and you have to deliver your pitch, right? If you're not able to deliver your message, then it doesn't matter. You haven't had an impact, right? So that is critical. And this goes back to communication, but really adaptive, dynamic and real-time communication is super, super important.
Thank you for that, sir. And the next question is that, considering that Google is the market leader and has and is so far ahead of its competition in many fields, what drives you to keep innovating on what already seems effective and established products?
I think you already know the answer to that, but history is littered with the remnants of companies and institutions that did not think ahead, that rested on their laurels. And by the time they figured out that they were going to become irrelevant, they're already irrelevant, right? You never want to be in that situation. So, with my responsibility, I'm in some sense less preoccupied with what happened yesterday and today. Well, with the war in Ukraine, I actually am very involved in what's happening every day. But it's much more what's going to happen in 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, because the thing you don't want to be is the person who was asleep at the wheel when the proverbial vehicle crashed, right? So there is nothing we can take for granted. The world is full of billions of really smart people, and they're not all here in Silicon Valley. They're all over, we're finding. So I think it's important, it's critical to stay keenly conscious. And by the way, I'm totally okay if the next massive multi-billion-dollar mega corporation comes from Chennai, right? It will happen. But the point is, to the extent that you have a job, your job is to make sure that you don't become irrelevant and go to sleep, right? And that in the process, we get there not by doing anything crazy, but by continuing to serve users and society, which is so core to our mission, right? Our mission, in the case of Google certainly, is to ensure that people have universal access to information, right? And are able to, because we think of information as so empowering. This is why I said earlier, the web is the greatest artifact since the printing press. And the printing press brought about, I don't know, 500 years of societal change, unleashed people from slavery and feudalism, right? I think the next 500 years are going to be unleashed by this, and we want to have an important role to play in
that. Thank you for that, sir. So the next question is from an attendee, and it is specific to the Google Flights case study. So did the study reveal that people chose flights with lower emissions, even if it was more expensive, or is that like a margin that they're willing to spend extra or something?
No, this is a very good
question. I understand. I think that might.
No, this is a great question, right? And the short answer is we are not entirely sure, right? The longer answer is in classical economics, the way people think about these situations when faced with multiple choices with different benefits, right? I can fly from A to B by, option 1 or option 2. Option 1 costs X, option 2 costs a little more, but is less, right? And so really the way economists look at this is a matter of the sensitivity, the price sensitivity of choice, meaning how much of a price differential is justified by the emission change, right? We don't have a good answer to that yet. It's still early studies. And we actually, hope to work with leading academics in some ways to try and figure this out, right? But it's a fascinating question. So thank you for that question. I don't yet know the answer. It's also very complex, let me just say, because markets are very efficient, meaning if you're the airline with the higher emission flight and consumers are choosing the lower efficient flight because of a small price disparity, then you will drop your price further to make up for that, right? So this is not a fixed point. It'll keep changing over time. And so it's a study that it behooves us to do.
Thank you for that, sir. So in an interview with Wired, you mentioned the need for users to express themselves more freely, like taking a photo of a boot and asking, is it good enough for hiking? So how much has Google Lens been able to achieve in this regard?
I would say we are in the beginning of the journey. Some of you may recall seeing a video from an search event we had last fall, I think October, where my colleague Pandu Nayak pointed his camera at his bicycle. Something was broken, and he takes a picture and says, "How do I fix this?" Right? And it comes back with an answer about the bicycle part that was broken, which has a French pronunciation, but I'm not going to get right, but something like derailleur, and then gave information on how to fix the derailleur, right? So we have the earliest glimmerings of this. I would say Lens by itself, which is recognizing objects, is in a pretty good place. But to combine that with a complex question like, how do I fix this? We're still in the early stages, and we're working very hard. And Pandu and his team are working every day on this.
Yes. So the next question is that, would you suggest whether one should transition into a management role early in their career, or should stick to the technical side of working, or how did you manage your transition, considering your interest in algorithms?
Yeah, that's a good question. My transition was almost accidental. I had been an individual research scientist for about 5 or 6 years. And then my department director came to me and said, I want you to become a manager. And I said, no, that's not for me. I know nothing about, I don't have an MBA. I don't know anything about management. Leave me alone. And he said, no, it's really easy. You just have to sign expense accounts. right? And I said, really, is that all there is to it? He said, promise, right? And I said, okay, fine, I'll sign expense accounts, right? But then from there, I got drawn more and more. Now, I would suggest that's not the way you get into it. I hope you can all be more deliberate than I was. I certainly was clueless. But you asked the question, should one get into it early or not, right? I think it really comes down to the individual. The big change, I said earlier that the similarity between a scientist and a manager was both have to ask the right questions. The difference is in the first case, you're asking the right question for your own scientific career. But as a manager, you have to care about the people whom you're responsible for and ask questions about their success, whether it's their project or their career. So you should do it when you've decided to invest in the success of the people you support. And when you're ready to do that, it's good, right? So I would say, excuse me, that is the point when you should make that switch. If you're not ready to make that switch to supporting others, don't do it. Make sense?
Yes, sir. Okay, sir. I think this will be the last question we'll be taking. So,
Okay.
What do you think about Web 3.0 and how do you think it's going to impact society?
I think Web 3.0 is an exciting but still very early development. You asked me earlier about when will we be able to use Lens to ask questions. I would say that technology is like 3 years ahead of Web 3.0. Web 3.0 is still early definition. It's a collection of new ideas, including a lot more virtual reality, right? Whether or not I like it or you like it, it is going to come. It is going to change society. And to me, the hardest question, which I grapple with, is whether it makes us all better human beings and a better human society, right? Because the inevitability shouldn't hide the fact that does more virtual interaction preclude more human interaction, right? Is that a good thing, right? What is the right mixture of human interaction and virtual interaction? What creates a better society? I think those are the hard questions that we'll be still answering 10 years from now when it's upon us, right? And I don't know the answer to that, but I think it's an exciting technical development, and the impact on society remains to be seen.
Thank you, sir. Just one last question. What do you think about the whole blockchain technology and the advent of NFTs and the craze behind buying and selling of NFTs?
Well, there's a whole bunch of questions, right? If I think of blockchain, right, it really, I think of it as a form of distributed computing, right? It's a set of distributed computing primitives. I think that's super exciting. And at that level, I think it's absolutely important to understand it, study, develop more primitives around it. Like you already have some things like Ethereum and others, right? If I think of assets like NFTs and so on, right? They're here to stay. They're simply a byproduct of digital signatures in some sense, and not surprising, right? Full disclosure, I do not own any NFTs. I don't even own cryptocurrencies, right? But I think it's a very interesting development. And, it's certainly one of the things that all of these new technologies are doing is democratizing information and in some sense power, right? So back to my earlier point about a long tail, information and control and power is devolving from a small number of state actors and or a small number of companies to a very long tail of mass, almost ability. And I think that's a good empowering thing.
Thank you, Professor Prabhakar Raghavan, for that wonderful, insightful session. I mean, it's really an honor to listen to you. And I think the students of IIT Madras are really blessed in that we have such illustrious, super accomplished alumni and whom we get to listen to like this, right? We are all your fans and we look forward to staying in touch, staying engaged with you. and look forward to hosting you sometime when you visit the campus. And thank you so much, Lynn, and the rest of the Google team for all your time and this wonderful session. I hope you have a great day ahead.
It's been wonderful. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Are.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.